All right, let's talk a little bit about yesterday's GDP announcement. I'm going to pull it up on my screen just so I'm looking at the correct numbers. So this was July 30th. The big announcement was real gross domestic product decreased at an annual rate of 32.9%. So first off, this is an advanced estimate. Really important thing is, well, maybe this is a technical thing, but GDP is an estimate. It's not something that we actually know. It's something where we have a lot of statisticians working really hard to try and figure out across 300 million people, what did we produce in a given time period? It's not something where we can just add it up. So with a business in a microeconomic context, you can say, what did they actually do? How much revenue did they bring in? Because you can look at all the bank accounts all at once. With GDP, we're trying to figure it out, but to actually get 100% non-estimate, the true figure, it would just be way too costly. It would require so much effort that it wouldn't be worth it. We would lose a lot of GDP trying to get a perfect number. That said, right, so anytime we get an estimate, the number's going to change. I think in October is when they release a revised estimate. So they keep working at this. So the number could change ultimately, but it's not going to change a huge amount, right? So first off, some other things that are important to understand this is an annualized number. So it's not saying that we have 30% less productivity than we had last year. It's saying basically if the whole year was as bad as the last 3 months, as the second quarter, this would be what? March, April through June, right? So if the whole year turns out to be as bad as April through June was, then we're looking at a 32.9% reduction in GDP, which is huge, right? That's a big, big number. So basically, if the fall and if the Christmas season turns out to be really bad, if that stuff also is shrinking at 32.9%, then we're basically looking at the most significant macroeconomic event of, certainly of recorded US history, possibly of the entire US history. That's gigantic. But it sounds a lot bigger than it actually is for two big reasons. So one is it's annualized, and some other stuff relates to the sort of a recession that we're in. We're in a recession that's more like the POW camp recession than the babysitting recession. And unlike even a POW camp recession, it's not that we're not getting stuff. We're not losing the ability to produce, with some important caveats. We're kind of mostly just on hold, right? So once things clear up, once it's safe to go back to work and we figure out how to make it safe to go back to work, things will bounce back, right? It's complicated, right? All this stuff is complicated, but it's not as scary as it sounds. So let's deal with these two big things that we need to account for. So first off, it's annualized. So 32.9%, we're basically saying if the whole year was like this, we would lose 32.9%. Right off the bat, if we just say, let's think about this for the quarter of the year that we're concerned with, now we're looking at, what is this? 32, that'd be 7, 8, 9-ish%. 9, what's 9 times 4 is 36. So about 8% for the quarter, right? So right off the bat, this annualized number, this is sort of making a projection across the entire year. Across the quarter on its own, 8% is still huge, right? That's a big number, but it's a whole lot smaller than 32.9%. Now the other thing, and this is a general thing about statistics, about time series statistics, is we know that there are patterns across the year. So if we look at a typical year, look at time moving across this way and real GDP, we know that in January, people just don't make as much stuff. So of the 4 quarters, we know that Q1, there's not a whole lot of productivity anyways. Q2, we've got more. Q3, I think, is usually a little bit lower, if my memory serves. And then Q4 is really where we're seeing most of our activity in a given year, at least in the US. So a typical year, we basically see productivity start really low and end up being really high around the holiday season. Right? This is where we're getting sort of most of our income across the year. Think about something like, well, think about what's happening at malls. The mall does most of its business leading up to the holiday season. In January, they try and do some sales, but basically there's a whole lot less activity. That doesn't mean that there's something wrong with the economy in January. It just means that's the part of the year we don't do much stuff. If we were in an agrarian society, we would have a lot more during the growing season, and especially the harvest season, and we would expect this to be a lot lower also. So if we were looking at GDP figures 200 years ago, we might expect a seasonal pattern that looks more like this, where we've got a lot of activity when it's warm and not much in the winter. So part of what's going on here is it's not just divided by 4, it's divided by what's the usual share of productivity in the second quarter of a typical year, right? And of course, this is not a typical year. So to seasonally adjust something, basically what we do, let's get rid of this blue, is if this red line is illustrating the seasonal component of a typical year's productivity, we're taking this figure and we're saying this 32.9% annualized fall in GDP, that basically accounts for, first off, we're projecting not just across one quarter, but all 4, but also that we're falling relative to this position, right? So that's a very short version of the whole idea, but let me just make up a story really quickly. So if we think about this as over multiple years, what we'll see in a typical year is something like this up and down, this cyclical pattern. If we want to make this graph more usable, what we would say is let's just kind of focus on this long run component. Let's skip out all the ups and downs because here we've got January and December and then the following January. It's not really reasonable to say that GDP fell, right? And that's what seasonal adjustment is about. I erased my seasonal adjustment point. Seasonal adjustment is about accounting for the fact that January and February are just slow months, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. So that 32.9%, this is big news, right? We got a really big emergency on our hands. Let's talk about emergencies and some other things here. So some related things from this particular recession. So first off, the framework we're going to use, we're going to adopt Harvard's framework, which is we have 2 big types of recessions. These aren't the only types of recessions, but these are pretty prominent. The babysitting recession goes like this. I don't buy stuff because I expect, for some reason, it just doesn't make sense for me to buy something right now. That means you have less income, so you stop buying stuff, which means the people you buy from have less income, so they stop buying stuff from me. And then we get in this vicious cycle, right? And we might get something like that if we are in a deflationary period. So the value of $1, right now $1.50 could buy me a can of Coke from a vending machine. If I expect that prices are going to fall in the future, if I'm thinking, yeah, maybe I buy a can of Coke, let's imagine like really extreme deflation. If I expect that the price of a can of Coke is going to fall in the next hour, well, I'm going to hold off on buying that can of Coke. I hold off on buying that can of Coke, and that contributes to the deflationary pressure. If our aggregate demand is falling, we're going to move down our aggregate supply curve to a lower price level, which means even more deflation, which means now I have even more incentive to push off buying this can of Coke. Now, eventually I get thirsty and I buy it anyways, but this could continue, especially if you're thinking about things like investments. Do I build a new factory? Well, I could build it now, but if I wait a year, my costs are going to be a lot lower with deflation, right? So why use the money I've got now if holding off means I could save 20%? And in particular, if I've got all, well, yeah, let me explain this part. So if I've got $1 million in the bank, and if deflation's happening, that means the average price level is falling, but I still have that $1 million, right? So if the price level gets cut in half, this can of Coke that's $1.50 is now 75 cents. A $30,000 car is now $15,000. If that's going to happen, my wealth doubles if I just sit on my cash, right? My $1 million becomes as though it's $2 million. So I don't invest in building this new factory because I expect my money is going to go further in the future. But if everyone's in this boat, everyone holds off, we get this babysitter recession. We are not in babysitter recession. Now, it could change, right? Who knows what happens after we've got a vaccine, or if we get a vaccine. It could turn into that. But right now, we're in something much more like the POW camp recession. We are in a bad position. GDP is falling, not because we're not buying stuff, not because we don't have the money, but because it's unsafe, right? Because there's a virus out there that's killing people and making people incredibly sick. So given the choice of not doing stuff, staying home and staying safe, or going out and increasing GDP in the short run, and then seeing a big fall in GDP when we all die, well, we go with the first option. We're basically in a holding pattern. Now that holding pattern would be a whole lot easier if we had a little bit of slack, if we had some savings built up, right? So here's my little pet peeve about how the news is covered, the economic news of the COVID crisis, is they talk about stimulus checks. Stimulus makes sense in a babysitting recession. You want to stimulate people to spend money. But in a POW camp recession, it doesn't make sense, right? So imagine in the POW camp recession, what do? We can't give people new cigarettes because those come in the Red Cross packages, but let's imagine we could. We give the prisoners more cigarettes so they have more money, but that doesn't help if what we're missing is the chocolate and the canned food and all the other things coming in those care packages. So adding money to an economy that's not productive is going to push up prices, but not really help. It's not going to help us to get the real stuff that we actually want. It's just going to give us, in the case of our economy, the paper money that we don't really want. We only want it if it can get us stuff. And if it can't, well, it doesn't do any good. Now, the relief end of things, that's valuable because it means that we can afford to stay inside. We can afford to lock down, which is going to make it less costly to get over the hump, right? To do something about the pandemic. Ideally, right? So this is a thing about emergencies more broadly. We would have planned better. George W. Bush had a plan. Obama had a plan. That plan was handed off to the current administration. And, they're doing different stuff. They were focused on different things. They had different priorities. And so maybe this emergency could have been better handled to begin with. Certainly, there were a lot of things that we could critique about this that made it a lot worse. But really, the big thing outside of policy is just sort of standard American culture. Americans don't save. And because we don't save, we're really vulnerable when something like this happens. If you don't have cash in the bank, if you don't have a rainy day fund, it becomes really difficult for you to stay locked down, to go into quarantine. If instead you got 6 months of savings, quarantine, and you got a bunch of dried beans in your basement, if you are prepared, this emergency would have mattered a whole lot less, right? So hopefully, maybe this happens, but hopefully the big lesson we take away from this is prepare better for emergencies. So we have sort of this idea of optimization, and that might make sense in an all else equal environment. So you think about, say, you've got $1,000 in your savings account. What can you do with that money? Well, the sort of pseudo optimization that we've been doing says, well, let's ignore the emergency. Let's not build up some slack. Let's not have that rainy day fund. $1,000 sitting in your savings account is going to get 0.001% interest. You're going to do a lot better if you, say, put that in the stock market. And over the long run, that's absolutely true. Right? Over the long run, you get 10% instead of a tenth of a percent. That's a good move as an individual, right? But when our individual behavior aggregates, sometimes funny things happen. More important for this particular episode in economic history, you're optimizing if things stay the same, but you're not preparing for something that might happen. When an emergency does come along, it's really helpful to have that rainy day fund. Now, let me also introduce an idea, sort of a more general idea, this idea of anti-fragility. So basically, what we've got, or what we've seen, is that our economy is fragile with respect to unforeseen big emergencies like this. We were not in a position to really do a good job handling this pandemic, and that's why we got this 32.9% figure, right? Hopefully we're learning, right? And as we learn, that annualized effect will matter less. Hopefully Q3 and Q4 are not as far below the normal as we figure things out and as things change. Hopefully we can move more in this direction, right? So we're sort of imagining a spectrum here. We're used to talking about these 2 points on the spectrum, something being fragile or something being robust. So as an example of something fragile, if you got, say, a drinking glass and you drop it on some rocks, it's going to shatter. It is fragile, right? Something that's robust, you drop it on the rocks and it's still okay, right? So you drop a plastic cup on some rocks, it doesn't break. But there's another way we can extend this and talk about something being anti-fragile, something that gains from that negative impact, right? So some aspects of the economy are definitely going to turn out to be anti-fragile. Zoom as a company certainly turned out to be anti-fragile to this particular problem. So everyone suddenly has to work from home. Suddenly there's a big opportunity, right? So for tech, they're more on this end, right? They're relatively anti-fragile. At least with respect to a public health crisis, something like retail is in a much more precarious position. If there's a big public health crisis, restaurants and stores are more like the glass shattering on the rocks, whereas Zoom is something more like, actually as an example, with plants. If you've got a plant and you sort of push it around a little bit, like if you got a basil plant right now, if you cut the tops off your basil plant, it's going to branch out and actually be more robust, right? A little bit of abuse actually makes it tougher. Immune systems, very much in this position. If you're young and you don't get exposure to dirt and germs and all kinds of things that might make you sick, it makes it much easier for you to get sick in the future, right? So I think I've talked about this before. The Amish have really low levels of allergies because pregnant women are out in the barn being exposed to dust and animals and all kinds of things. And as a result, them and their child develop really strong immune systems. That exposure to low levels of disorder make them relatively anti-fragile, right? It makes the system, your immune system, anti-fragile. So this is sort of a good idea to keep in the back of your head when you're thinking about how do I adjust my life so that I gain from these sorts of things? How do I put myself in a position where when bad things happen, I come out better? So as a financial move, well, you could invest in whatever the next Zoom is going to be. Now at this point, the price of Zoom is up, right? It's too late to jump in and make a lot of money off that opportunity. But you can ask, what's the next big thing that's going to happen? And how do you set your portfolio up to gain from those things that might happen? For your own life, how do you establish resilience? How do you put yourself in a position where something that knocks out your competition puts you at an advantage? If we're thinking about the economy as a whole, well, think about the difference between our big diverse economy versus the economy we had 200 years ago. Or actually, here's a really good example, the Irish potato famine. The problem with the Irish potato famine was they were growing 3 different cultivars, 3 different varieties of potatoes that were genetically very, very similar, It was a very fragile system. When a fungus evolved that could kill one potato plant showed up, it killed all the potato plants, right? So in that case, you had this very fragile economy. People depended on the potatoes to live, and the potatoes depended on being lucky enough not to have the wrong kind of pest turn up. With our economy, it's much more towards the anti-fragility. We've got companies like Zoom, we've got Amazon, we've got small companies, we've got a bunch of different people trying a lot of different things. We've got food sources all over the place. We've got hydroponic companies in New Jersey growing stuff in a warehouse. We've got big industrial farms out in Iowa. We've got little organic farms up in Vermont. We've got a lot of different things going on. And so when something comes along that negatively impacts one part, it creates opportunities for the other parts. And the system as a whole is able to learn, right? So this episode certainly sucks right now. 32.9%. Like I said, that's a scarier sounding number than the truth. But if things stay as bad as they have been, we might see a really big contraction in the GDP because of the mismanagement of this crisis. That said, in the long run, right, 10 years from now, we're going to be in a much better position, right? 10 years from now, we're going to have more people working from home. We're going to have better internet infrastructure. We're going to be better prepared for things like this. People are going to start saving and having rainy day funds. People are going to start keeping food stockpiled so that the next time this happens, they don't have to all rush to the grocery store all at once and get everyone sick. In the long run, we are certainly more in this anti-fragile position, but it's worth asking ourselves, how do we make sure we're moving more in this direction and not doing things that make us a lot of money in the short run when things are good, but make us fragile in the long run? All right, let's close that there.